Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm doing 10 cards with the My Monthly Hero September 2018 card kit. So we're going to jump in with our first card. I'm taking some white cardstock and my stitched rectangle dies here. We're going to create a large window in this panel. I'm going to set it up a little bit so I can have room for my sentiment below. So it's not perfectly centered. I'm also going to create a smaller frame to fit around my window to give it a little bit of detail using some white cardstock. Now I'm going to go ahead and glue down my frame to my window, and we'll just set that aside. And now we're going to do some stamping. So I'm going to grab both the vases in the stamp set and then the large leaf branch. I'm going to place those on acrylic block, grab my VersaFine Onyx black ink, and we're going to stamp the larger branch here 3 times. I'm stamping on some Canson XL watercolor cardstock because we are going to use our watercolors to color these images in. I'm going to go ahead and grab my silver embossing powder and go over my branches. I thought silver would look nice, give it a more little soft and elegant look. I'll go ahead and melt that, and then we're going to finish off our stamping. I'm actually going to stamp 4 of the vases, but only use 2 of them, or 3 of them actually. And the 4th one we use in another card later on. But I'm going to go over my vases with some clear embossing powder. When I watercolor, this is great because it contains my watercolor. Now I'm going to go over my vases just with some clear water, and basically I'm going to let the watercolor do its work. I'm going to I left the watercoloring in. I just sped it up a little bit because the video did run long. But I just added drops of color on my vases and let the watercolor move around and let it do its thing. And then if I oversaturated it, I just picked it up with my towel, blotting it. But I wanted to create 3 different color vases. So I have a pink one and an orangish one and then like a corally color one. And this last one is more corally, but we're going to use that for another card later on. Now I'm going to do the same thing to my branches using the green watercolor. And once we have everything colored in, we're going to set those aside to dry. Now we're going to stamp our sentiment here. I chose the sentiment that says "You are vibrant." And I'll just stamp that with my VersaFine Onyx black ink on the very bottom here of my panel. Lovely. Okay, now I'm going to grab my card base. I wanted to use something in the background, and so I have some vellum. It's kind of like vellum. It's paper, texture paper that's very thin, but it has wood grain texture to it. I'm going to cut off a small piece and place that directly on my card base. This way behind my window I have some texture, but it's still going to keep it really soft. Now I went ahead and popped up my frame with some foam tape and placed that on my card base. And now we're ready to, these just about dry, so I'm going to take the coordinating dies and we'll just, oh no, I did add some sparkle to it. I'm using my aqua shimmer pen because it's extra juicy and going over my watercolor images. Now it does pick up the watercolor, so I just blot my brush off on a towel, and then this way the ink doesn't transfer to the next vase. But I just glued my branches on the inside of my vase. I actually used my craft knife and cut a slit on the very top of the vases and just slid them in there. And then I added them to my card. And I'm going to leave it like that. That's card number 1, guys. I think it turned out really pretty. Here's a close-up. Okay, now we're going to move along to card number 2. I created a frame using those same rectangle dies. And I'm actually using the packaging that the watercolor came in. I cut out 2 small panels, and I wanted to use these leaf notes. But since there was only tackiness on the very bottom, I didn't want them to shift. So I thought putting them between acetate would work great. So this way they don't shift. But I'm just placing them around using my frame as a guide. I glued one of the plastic sheets to my frame. Then I have another one off to the side. I'm going to trim this one in half and just kind of fill in any open areas. I did leave the top open. Now when I glued down my plastic, I actually used my Nuvo Deluxe adhesive. And I would suggest maybe using a tape runner or some score tape instead, because the glue took a long time to dry. But I think that's going to look really nice. I'm going to trim it down a little bit and then just use my glue and attach that behind my window there. This way it's kind of like sandwiched between two pieces of plastic. And I know it's going to stay stationary and they're not going to move. I want to create a shaker card for this one. I think this alone looked pretty, especially when you put it behind a white background. You can see how pretty that looked. But I want to go one step further and add some sequins. So I went through my autumn colored sequins. I grabbed some golds and reds and oranges, and I'm going to fill in my shaker panel we created. I just doubled up on the foam tape and placed it around my frame, and then I did add a piece of cardstock behind it, and then I'm just taping it down to my card base. I stamped Happy Autumn with my Onyx Black ink on the very bottom there, and that finishes off card number 2. Okay, for card number 3, let's see. I have a piece of white cardstock, and we're going to go ahead and no, this is watercolor cardstock, guys. I'm going to stamp the sentiment that says, "You bring color to my world." Now this card is basically really simple, so but I thought it was something a little bit different that you could do with the stamp set. Now I trimmed down my watercolor cardstock to create with a stitched rectangle die, creating a panel. And then I used my spray bottle and went over the entire watercolor cardstock and sprayed it. Now I'm taking the watercolor and just doing some swooshes along my, I'm not going all the way to the edge, but I'm just, again, letting the watercolor do its work. And I'm just blending colors that I think that would go great together. I used the reds and the pinks and the oranges and yellows, and then decided, oh, we'll throw in some greens. I think that color combination looks really pretty. Now it looks really intense here. I'm going to dab off the excess on the sides, but with the watercolor it does dry a way lighter, and so I will use my heat gun, dry it, and then we're going to do it one more time. Go over the same areas with the same colors, kind of intensifying the color. I wanted it to be a little bit more vibrant. So the more you do it, the more vibrant it gets. Just make sure you dry it in between. And I'm happy with the way this turned out. Okay, now I wanted to add a little sparkle, so I'm going to grab some Perfect Pearls from Ranger. These are the biscotti color. Now if you don't have Perfect Pearls, if you wanted to use your shimmer spritz, I think it would create the same effect. But I'm going to add a little bit of pearlescence to my panel. Since it's a pretty basic card, I wanted to do something a little special. And the Perfect Pearls really added a nice sheen to my background panel here. I'm just adding water and then dipping my brush in my Perfect Pearls and blending it on the background. Here you can see a close-up of what it looks like. Now I did this so many times my paper did warp, and usually whenever I use watercolor, I like to use fun foam on the entire background. This way it will help flatten it. So this is just a piece of adhesive back fun foam. Lovely. We're going to grab our card base. It's going to be a side folding. All my cards today are an A2 size card base. They're 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I'm just going to place my panel on my card base, and then for a few bells and whistles, I'm going to go in with some sequins, some clear sequins, and then to bring out that gold in the sentiment and also in the Perfect Pearls, I'm adding some Nuvo honey gold. Is that? Yes, honey gold glitter dots. And that finishes off that card. Now for card number 4, we're going to stamp this image. We're going to stamp it twice. That came in the stamp set. We're going to flip our panel around, and I'm just inking it up with my Memento Tuxedo Black ink. For this card I did Copic coloring, and so I didn't leave that in. but I just used some greens, and then for the little they're not really flowers, but the other images I used some warm grays, kind of keeping it a little bit neutral. Now I cut out a panel here with white cardstock, and then using red cardstock I cut out a slightly larger panel. Now there's this little dot in the stamp set, and I'm sure it has a purpose, but I have no idea what the purpose was. So if I see a dot, I'm going to make polka dots. So I'm using some Simon Says Stamp Barely Beige ink. Now this is going to lighten up quite a bit, but it's going to leave a little bit of texture in my background. Subtle texture, which is nice. So I just stamped it all along my white cardstock panel, and then I'm going to take a double-stitched circle die and cut out a circle, kind of offsetting it a bit, and then I'm going to take a circle die that's going to fit right on the inside and cut out another circle. That's going to be for my sentiment. Now once those are done, I'm going to go ahead and stamp my sentiment on the smaller circle, and then I'm going to layer both of those floral images together, and then I did go ahead and pop them up with some foam tape, but creating almost like a circle, and I did go ahead and pop up my sentiment with some foam tape as well. I'm just going to arrange my greenery on my panel, something a little bit different, but I like the way this turned out. I'm just going to use my tape runner, and we'll go ahead and adhere this to our top folding card base. And then for a little sparkle, I'm going to use some Nuvo Morning Dew Jewel Drops. These ones work the same way as glossy accents do, so they'll dry clear. But I'm going to add a few dots around my card, and that finishes off that one. Something I did go on the inside of those little flourishes with my aqua shimmer pen. So underneath the glossy, or the Morning Dew, has sparkle. Okay, card number 5. We're already jumping in. We're going to stamp our sentiment. I'm going to emboss it, so I'm going to use my VersaFine Onyx Black ink. The sentiment says, "Life is full of beauty." I'm going to go over it with some silver embossing powder, and I'll just go ahead and melt that. And then I'll take a rectangle die and cut out my panel. I also cut out a piece of yellow cardstock that I had in my stash. I'm going to attach that to the very top of my panel, leaving my sentiment on the bottom. Now to cover up that seam, I have a piece of silver mirror cardstock, and then I'm going to go grab a double-stitched border die that I had in my stash and just add a little bit of texture to that silver mirror cardstock. I'll run that through my die cut machine. You can see the texture here. It's kind of out of focus, but it really does look nice, especially on the silver mirror. Just using my glue, I'll attach that to my border, my seam there, to cover it up. And then any excess overhanging we'll just trim off. This is another pretty simple card, but I think sometimes simple is really pretty, so I like the way this turned out also. Okay, next I'll grab a piece of white cardstock and we're going to do some stamping. There's this floral image, because it looks like there's little berries on this branch, so we'll call it a floral image. I'm going to take my yellow Copic marker and just fill in those berries, and then I'll take the coordinating dies and just cut out both of those flourishes. Now I am going to pull in that fourth base that I used for my first card, and I'm just going to cut an opening on the very top and then slide those floral images inside my vase, and then I did add foam tape behind it to pop it up. I found just cutting one side of the vase all the way to the edge and then sliding those in worked a lot better, and you can't even tell that I did a full half cut on that vase top. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and place my vase right above the beauty, kind of offsetting it a bit. Lovely. Now I'm going to go over my little yellow floral images with my glitter. This is Silver Moon Dust. just to bring in some of that silver from my border. And then I'm going to take some sparkling clear sequins and just add a few around my image, keeping it very clean and simple, but I love the outcome. Okay, now after I got all my bells and whistles on here, I realized, well, I didn't add my panel to my card base, so I'm going to actually put foam tape directly on my card base, making sure it's going to fit behind that panel. I'll just remove the release paper, and then we'll kind of do this backwards. Place the panel right in the center, just for a little bit of dimension. Lovely. And that finishes off that card. Okay, now moving along to card number 6. We're going to do some stamping. So I grabbed the little, we're going to stamp on watercolor cardstock. And so I grabbed the maple leaf, and I'm going to use my VersaFine ink. This way I know where I'm stamping. But I'm going to kind of trail these maple leaves, light at the top at a diagonal, and then kind of heavy at the bottom. For this card I wanted to try something different, and it really did turn out so pretty. We'll just stamp a few more on the top here. I am going to later on create a panel, so I wasn't worried too much about the end ones. But I'm going to go over my images with some silver embossing powder, and I'll go ahead and melt that. Now next I'm going to use some masking fluid. This is masking fluid by Nuvo. And first time I used it, and the bottle actually says do not shake, but first thing I do when I pick up a bottle is shake it. So there was a lot of air bubbles in there. But I'm going to go around each one of those maple leaves with the masking fluid. Now, once I have that done, I'm going to take a little straight pin and kind of poke out all the little bubbles that shouldn't be there because I shook it. And we'll set that aside to dry. Now while that's drying, we'll work on our sentiment. The sentiment for this card, I chose Life is Full of Beauty. I'm just going to stamp it on some white cardstock, and I'm going to heat emboss it with some silver embossing powder, so it's the same silver as my maple leaves there. But we'll stamp that, go over our sentiment with our embossing powder, and then I'll go ahead and melt it. Now once that's heat set, I wanted just something extra because there's not very many layers on this card today. So I'm going to take that same double stitched border die that just creates stitch lines, and I'm going to add stitch lines to the top of my sentiment and also to the bottom. This is just going to add something a little extra special. But I'll run that through my die cut machine, and then I'll just trim down my sentiment. So I have nice detail, and I like the way that turned out. Okay, now I'm hoping the masking fluid is dry by now, and now we're going to watercolor our background. So I'm going to actually take some clear water, and I'm going to go around each one of my maple leaves. I didn't want to go over, if I gave it time to dry completely, I'm pretty sure I could just use my spray bottle and mist my entire background panel, but I was afraid it was still wet. So I'm just kind of doing areas. But I'm just kind of spreading out the color. Here I'm using the pink, and then the carmine. And I'm just adding water all around. I wanted it to kind of spread out, and so I wanted my background to be kind of naturally flowing. But I'm going to add some oranges and reds, and then I decided to add a little bit of green accents. And I want to be real careful because if you mix the green in with the darker pink or the red, it will create a muddy brown. So I was kind of keeping it separated. But once I was happy with the outcome, I used my heat gun to dry it. And it did dry a lot softer. I also didn't know how the heat was going to react with my masking fluid, but it worked out great. I was happy with the result. Okay, I'm going to take my finger and just kind of rub away that masking fluid off of my silver maple leaves. And so they're nice and white behind. And I thought this was just something a little bit neat and different. And I like the outcome. And it picks up really nice. Okay, I already cut out my panel that's going to be a little bit smaller than my card base. I'm going to add some foam tape behind my sentiment, give this card a little bit of dimension, and we'll place that towards the lower portion of our panel. Lovely. We'll just use our tape runner and adhere this to our card base. And then for bells and whistles, I'm going to add some droplets, just a few here and there, and then that finishes off that card. I just basically let the watercolor do the work, do its magic. But okay, now we're going to move along to our card number 7. Now I'm using the frame here, and I'm going to cut out a frame with the white cardstock and then also some gold cardstock. Now I trimmed down my gold cardstock frame with so it's an A2 size, so it's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, and then my white frame is slightly smaller. Now I'm going to use my tape runner. I'm going to adhere my white frame to the gold frame. But originally I was going to layer them the same way, and I thought, well, I'm going to actually flip it around. This way the gold's more predominant on one side and then the white's more predominant on the other side. I think that turned out really neat. Okay, I did now I grab this is actually my card base here, and I'm going to grab the little maple leaf branch that's in the stamp set, and I'm just kind of playing around with the position. I had grabbed the sentiment here that says branch out, and I wanted it to fit on the inside of my window, so I'm just kind of playing around with the placement. Once I'm happy, I'll grab my mini Misty, and I'll just pick up my images. I'll go over my my card base with my anti-static powder bag, and then I'm going to go over my images with Versamark ink, and I stamped it. I'm going to grab my gold embossing powder for this portion, and I'm going to go over it and heat emboss and melt. And then I popped up my frame with some foam tape, and then this is going to go directly on my card base. And again, this is going to cover the entire card front. But I want to just keep this one clean and simple. Sometimes when you add gold, I think it just makes it real elegant. And that completes that card. Here's a close-up. Okay, moving along to card number 8. We're going to do some stamping. I'm using this image here, and I'm actually going to stamp it 5 times. I stamped it 6 because one of them didn't turn out very good, but I'm only going to use 5. And then I stamped with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and then I'm making sure it's really dry. I did stamp it on some watercolor cardstock, and so I wanted to make sure that that blank ink is nice and dry before I added my watercolor. Now I'm using the little brushes that came in the kit because this is a little bit more detailed. But I didn't leave all the coloring in, but I'm just going to go color in my images with the watercolors. I guess I did leave the watercoloring in. I just sped it up. But for the little lantern images, it looks like I'm going really heavy, but I blotted it off because I wanted like a corally, pinky corally color. And to get that, I did have to blot it off and redo it a few times. And when I did that, the ink kind of spread out over my images. Well, I have a solution for the ink that's overlapping, so it doesn't look so messy, basically. I'm going to take the coordinating dies, and I'm going to cut out each one of those little images, and then I'm going to take some silver cardstock, And I'm going to use that same die that I used to cut out these images and cut out 5 silver images. Now, to take away from my ink smudges, I thought the silver, people's eye would maybe go to the silver more than they would the ink that was outside the lines. But and it actually turned out really well. You can't even hardly tell that I went outside the lines with my watercolor. But I'm going to offset it a bit, and then I'm going to layer the silver to my images. Lovely. Now I have a panel here that's 4 inches by 5 1/4, and I'm going to trim off one side, and then I'm going to basically cut out that middle piece. We don't need that middle piece there. Okay, I'm going to trim it down a little bit more, and then once I'm happy, I'm going to take my images. I'm actually going to take the same size panel that I had just cut that middle piece out of, and I'm going to temporarily adhere it to that panel. This way, whenever I add my images, it's going to remain the same size. I was afraid if I didn't use that background piece that either my panel would be crooked or it wouldn't fit my card base, because there are stitch lines along that panel. But so I just temporarily adhered it. But I'm going to go ahead and just glue down the ends of each one of my images in that open area there. I started with the top and the bottom, and then I'll just fill in another top and bottom, and then that way they're kind of evenly spaced. And then we'll finish off this last one here. This card is kind of a little bit different, but I love the way that it turned out. You can't see the dimension that it has from the camera view. Hopefully maybe on Instagram or on my blog you could see more detail of the way it looks. But I'm stamping my sentiment. It says best wishes. And I think the glue is dry enough to where now I can remove it from my back panel. And then this is going to be my panel for my card base. I thought this is a really neat way to use these images. I'm going to pop this panel up with some foam tape. And we'll place that on my card base. And you can see it leaves a little bit of a white border around the edges. And then I did take my Nuvo glitter drops, this is silver moon dust, and added a few little drops of silver on those little lantern elements. And that finishes off that card. Okay, card number 9. We're going to do some more embossing. Now this one, we're going to do some heat embossing, and then I'm going to do some watercolor resist. So I'm taking the branch here. This is the kind of curved branch in the stamp set, and I'm stamping it all along my panel here. I'm using Versamark ink, so it's a little bit hard to see, but I'm going to go over my branches with some clear embossing powder. I'll go ahead and heat set that, and you can kind of tell where the placement is. And then there's this little lantern flower. I'm going to actually use my Versamark and stamp that lantern flower on the edges of the branches, so it kind of looks continuous. Now I did this in separate parts because I wanted to be able to see where I was stamping. But I went ahead and melted that, added clear embossing powder. And then I also grabbed the maple leaf here. I'm going to ink my maple leaf up with some Versamark ink, and I'm going to stamp that all around my background panel as well. Kind of attaching the stem to the stem of the branches. Once we have that done, I'm going to add a little bit of water to each one of my color dots here, and then I'm going to spray my background panel with water, and then I'm just going to swish some colors horizontally along my panel. I want to do some real warm colors, so I'm using oranges, reds, and browns, and a little bit of yellow, just to create a real fun fall background. Once I'm happy with the way it turned out, I'll go ahead and melt it. Oh my goodness. I need more coffee. But I go ahead and dry my watercolor cardstock. And I did spray it with my shimmer spritz. So it does have sparkle in there. And I think it turned out really neat. It did warp my paper quite a bit, but again, if you use fun foam and cover your entire back panel, it'll work out great. Now I cut out a vellum circle and I stamped my sentiment that says thankful towards the top, and I just used my VersaFine and went over it with clear embossing powder. Now I did finish the sentiment with a stamp set that I had in my stash. I think it was from Lawn Fawn, but it says for you. So my sentiment will say thankful for you. I just stamped it on black cardstock and then heat embossed it with white embossing powder. I'll add that to my vellum there. And then I thought it needed a little bit more, so I took that maple leaf image and using some spice marmalade, I stamped that on some white cardstock. And then I'm also going to be using some abandoned coral, and I stamped that color as well. I'm going to take my aqua shimmer pen. Since my background has a lot of sparkle in it, I thought the shimmer pen would be great to blend out that color on my maple leaves. I did have to wipe it in between because it was transferring the ink. But I added adhesive behind the maple leaves and my For You, and then place my vellum on my panel. This way you can't see the adhesive showing through. But I did pop up my maple leaves with foam squares. Next I'm going to add my panel to my card base with, again, fun foam, and that finishes off that card. Something a little bit different. Now for my final card today, we're going to do some more stamping. We're going to keep this one clean and simple. I stamped this image here and I just colored it in with my Copic markers. And then I die cut it out. Now I'm going to use my watermark ink to create watermarks on a piece of orange cardstock that I had cut out using my stitched rectangle die. I just went corner to corner, kind of at an angle, and then I went ahead and popped up my image with some foam squares, and I'm going to place that on my panel. Now originally this was going to be a vertical card, but my sentiment wouldn't fit. So this was a happy mistake. I wanted to use Happy Autumn, and I didn't want to go over the stem, and I didn't want another piece of cardstock on top. So I decided just to flip my panel over horizontally. So we're going to make a side folding card for this one. I'm going to ink up my sentiment with my black ink, and I'll just stamp that below my colored in image. It says Happy Autumn. And I like it, side folding. I just placed that on my card base, adding a little sparkle with my aqua shimmer pen, and then I added some white droplets with my Simply White Nuvo crystal drops. And that finishes off that card. Now here's a look at all 10 cards that I made today using the My Monthly Hero September 2018 card kit. Thanks so much for joining me for this, guys. I wanted to give you some different ideas on how to use it. But I think it's a very versatile kit, and I love playing with the dot palettes. I'm not sure if kits are available, but if they are, I'll leave links in the description area if you're interested. And I encourage you to check out the close-up pictures over on my blog. But I really enjoyed this kit. I think it was so fun. Thanks so much for joining me, guys. I wish you a fantastic weekend, and we will see you again real soon. Bye-bye.